There is always more than one factor that contributes to the outcome of an air disaster. This accident, however, truly speaks for itself. It's a stunning tale of how a single mistake, born from the need to navigate a perceived threat rooted in an old design flaw, quickly spiraled into something monstrous. What happened here is, in every sense of the word, horrific. Pure terror. And none of it had to happen. It was 7 a.m. on Sunday, July 5, 1970. The crew of Air Canada Flight 621 was preparing for a transcontinental journey across North America, departing from Montreal and bound for Los Angeles, with a scheduled stopover in Toronto. In the cockpit, the 3 flight crew members were conducting pre-flight checks. Meanwhile, in the cabin, 6 flight attendants greeted passengers, assisted with seating, and prepared the galley. A total of 100 passengers had booked seats on Flight 621 that morning. Some were only traveling as far as Toronto, while others were in for the long haul, or even connecting to further destinations beyond Los Angeles. Among them was Montreal restaurateur Mansing Wong, traveling with his wife and 11-year-old granddaughter, Susie. Their final destination was San Francisco, where they planned to visit family. Also on board were twin sisters, Luella and Linda Earl, both student nurses who worked in a hospital. Their trip was purely for pleasure, a long-awaited 2-week vacation. They were scheduled to disembark in Toronto and continue their journey to the United States on another flight. Not everyone was traveling for leisure. Claude Holliday, a Bell Telephone representative, was flying strictly for business. It's easy to forget, when seated in the cramped confines of an airplane, that every passenger around you has their own story, their own destination, their own reason for traveling. Yet on this flight, all their journeys would soon become one. The plane that would carry them across the continent was a Douglas DC-8-63, a modern, high-capacity aircraft. Douglas had merged with McDonnell Aircraft just a few years prior, making this plane technically a McDonnell Douglas DC-8. It had rolled off the Long Beach production line in April of that year. This particular DC-8 variant was the longest and most advanced version of the aircraft at the time, offering higher capacity than any other commercial jet in the mid-1960s. The aircraft in question, CFTIW, was delivered to Air Canada brand new and had accumulated only 453 flight hours before its tragic loss on July 5. A rare photograph of CFTIW was taken by aviation photographer Terry Waddington just months before the disaster. It remains the only known surviving image of the aircraft before its destruction. Other photographs of the plane, once known to exist, have since faded into lost media. At the helm of Flight 621 was Captain Peter Hamilton, a highly experienced 50-year-old pilot. He had joined Air Canada in 1946 after serving in the Canadian Air Force during World War II. Like many senior pilots of his era, his career had evolved alongside the rapid transformation of commercial aviation. By the time of the accident, Hamilton had amassed nearly 19,000 flight hours, with 2,900 of them in the DC-8. He was well rested. This was his first day back at work after a 4-day break. He would be the pilot flying the first leg to Toronto. Sitting beside him was First Officer Donald Rowland, 40 years old, also with a military background. He had joined Air Canada in 1957, accumulating over 7,000 flight hours, with 5,500 logged in the DC-8. Like Hamilton, Rowland was well rested, having just returned from a vacation in the United Kingdom with his wife. The third member of the flight crew was Second Officer Gordon Hill, who served as flight engineer. At 28 years old, he was the youngest in the cockpit. While significantly less experienced than his colleagues, he had 1,300 total flight hours. Like the others, he was also coming back to work after time off, having spent the previous day settling into a new home. These men were no strangers to each other, especially Captain Hamilton and First Officer Rowland, who had flown together numerous times. Over the years, they had discussed various aspects of aviation in the cockpit. Their familiarity with each other's habits, preferences, and working styles was significant, and would later become a crucial point of interest for investigators. In fact, what was discovered on the cockpit voice recorder, CVR, after the crash would raise unsettling questions, ones that would change the course of the investigation forever. With all passengers and luggage loaded, and pre-flight checks complete, the four JT3D engines of the DC-8 roared to life. At 7:17 a.m., Air Canada Flight 621 departed Montreal, beginning its journey across 300 miles to Toronto. Aboard the aircraft were 109 passengers and crew. The flight to Toronto was expected to take around an hour. Captain Hamilton was the pilot flying for this leg. The journey itself was mostly uneventful. The sky had some cloud cover, but visibility remained good, making for ideal flying conditions. At the time, cockpit voice recorders, CVRs, were still a relatively new technology. In 1970, most could record only about 30 minutes of cockpit audio before re-recording over previous data. The transcript of Flight 621 CVR begins exactly 32 minutes and 39 seconds before the disaster. The first recorded transmission was First Officer Rowland making a routine call to Toronto Centre, reporting their altitude after leveling off at 27,000 feet. Meanwhile, Captain Hamilton casually chatted with the crew about his time off. Everything was completely normal, except for one minor but unusual occurrence. At 29 minutes to disaster, the cockpit voice recorder picked up an unexpected visit from a flight attendant entering the flight deck. She had an interesting update. One of the passengers, who happened to be an Air Canada ground worker, had noticed something strange from their window seat on the left side of the aircraft. They reported that a panel was missing from engine number 1, the outermost left engine. Though the pilots were surprised, they were not overly concerned. The missing access panel was not a flight-critical component, though it would require maintenance upon arrival in Toronto. The crew relayed the issue to Air Canada Operations, who acknowledged it. The conversation quickly shifted to discussing switching aircraft once they landed. By this time, Flight 621 had already begun its descent into Toronto, approaching from the south for runway 32, known today as runway 33R. The crew had been assigned a back-course localizer approach, a standard instrument approach, but flown using the localizer signal in reverse. At 10 minutes from landing, Flight 621 passed over downtown Toronto, preparing to turn onto the base leg before making its final approach. When investigators later analyzed the cockpit voice recorder, they noted that the approach up until this point had been completely normal. However, in 1970, there were no regulations requiring a sterile cockpit below 10,000 feet, a rule that now mandates only operational conversations during critical phases of flight. As a result, Flight 621's crew continued casual discussions, including company talk and remarks about Toronto's rising housing market. Despite this, they were still performing all necessary aviation tasks, switching radio frequencies, setting navigation systems, and running checklists. The before-landing checklist specifically called for the spoilers to be armed before landing, yet the pilots appeared to be discussing activating them during the flare or touchdown instead. This deviation seemed minor, but it would set the stage for disaster. What exactly did they mean by "on the flare"? Why was Captain Hamilton frustrated? How did this misunderstanding lead to catastrophe? The answers to these questions would soon become painfully clear, and they would uncover a fatal procedural mistake that should never have happened. As it turns out, this discussion about the spoilers touches on a broader conversation among DC-8 pilots at the time. Before we continue, let's quickly clarify what spoilers are. because they play a crucial role in what's about to unfold. Spoilers are wing-mounted devices designed to reduce lift. If you've ever watched through an airplane window during landing, you've likely seen them. Panels that pop up from the wing surface upon touchdown. That's the key detail. Spoilers typically deploy when the aircraft is on the ground. However, they can be used in flight if commanded by the pilot. In many modern aircraft, spoilers, also called speed brakes, can be deployed mid-air to increase the rate of descent or assist with braking. But the Douglas DC-8 had a unique spoiler system. Unlike other aircraft, the primary purpose of the DC-8 spoilers was for ground use, to kill lift upon landing, allowing full weight to transfer onto the landing gear for better braking performance. In flight, the 3 outboard spoilers on each wing could deflect slightly to assist with roll control, working in tandem with the ailerons. But aside from that, they were considered strictly ground-use devices. The ground spoilers on the DC-8 only became operational once the landing gear was extended. This model did not use spoilers for in-flight speed braking. Instead, reverse thrust on the inner engines was used to slow the aircraft in descent. Each wing had 3 outboard spoilers, which assisted in roll control. 2 inboard spoilers, used exclusively on the ground. A total of 10 spoiler panels, all of which would deploy simultaneously upon touchdown. But how exactly did they deploy? Most airliners use a mechanical system that automatically raises the spoilers when the aircraft touches down. From the pilot's perspective, this system is engaged by setting the spoilers or speed brakes to armed before landing. On the DC-8, the ground spoiler control was located on the right side of the throttle console. The lever was bright yellow and had 3 settings. Retract stows the spoilers. Extend deploys the spoilers manually. Armed prepares the spoilers to deploy automatically upon touchdown. When the lever was set to armed, it did not mean the spoilers were deployed yet, only that they were primed to extend once the aircraft touched the ground. A combination of sensors detected landing gear compression and wheel spin to trigger the deployment sequence. Now, let's go back to Flight 621 and re-examine what the pilots said about the spoiler arming procedure. We know the before-landing checklist explicitly required the spoilers to be armed when the landing gear was lowered. However, from the cockpit voice recorder transcript, it's clear the pilots did not follow this procedure. Instead, they discussed arming them later, on the flare. Why? This taps into a wider debate among DC-8 pilots at the time. Some pilots were hesitant to arm the spoilers too early due to fears of uncommanded in-flight deployment, which could cause a dangerous loss of lift at a critical phase of flight. Where did this concern come from? It likely stemmed from previous DC-8 incidents involving unintended spoiler deployment. Captain Hamilton was aware of at least one such case, a Scandinavian Airlines DC-8 crash in Norway. He also mistakenly believed that a Canadian Pacific DC-8 crash in Tokyo had been caused by a similar issue, though in reality, it was not. As these concerns spread, some pilots actively avoided arming the spoilers early in the approach. The worry was that, once armed, there was little to stop them from deploying mid-flight due to an electrical malfunction or system error. Douglas had attempted to address these fears by adding extra safety redundancies in later DC-8 models, including the accident aircraft. However, these precautionary measures did little to reassure pilots. The fear of spoilers remained deeply ingrained in their operational habits. As a result, some pilots, like Captain Hamilton, preferred to bypass arming the spoilers entirely and instead deploy them manually once the aircraft was safely on the ground. Officially, this violated Air Canada's checklist procedure, but it was a widely known practice among DC-8 crews. Interestingly, First Officer Rowland also shared concerns about arming the spoilers too early. However, his approach was different from Captain Hamilton's. Captain Hamilton's preference, keep the spoilers retracted throughout the approach, and deploy them manually after touchdown. First Officer Rowland's preference: arm the spoilers during the flare, just before touchdown, so they would still deploy automatically but at a later moment. While they had different methods, both pilots agreed on one principle: they did not want the spoilers armed early in the approach, as per standard procedure. They had flown together often and had an informal agreement. If Rowland was pilot flying, Hamilton would arm the spoilers on the flare as per Rowland's preference. If Hamilton was pilot flying, Rowland would wait to deploy them after touchdown as per Hamilton's preference. This wasn't a disagreement in an argumentative sense. Rather, it was a professional preference. However, in this case, it meant ignoring the before-landing checklist. So when Hamilton said, "All right, give them to me on the flare. I've given up. I'm tired of fighting it," this was him conceding to Rowland's preference, allowing the spoilers to be armed on the flare instead of after touchdown. Now that we understand the context behind the spoiler decision, let's be clear. This alone did not cause the crash. However, this moment set the stage for what might be one of the most devastating honest mistakes in aviation history. The real disaster, the fatal error that doomed Flight 621, was about to unfold in just a few moments. It was now 8 a.m., and Flight 621 continued its approach toward runway 32. The crew contacted Toronto Tower, established themselves on the back course, and deployed the flaps, configuring the aircraft for landing. The before-landing checklist was nearly complete, with one exception: the spoilers. Second Officer Gordon Hill reminded them that the spoilers still needed to be set. Flight 621 was number 1 for landing, but another aircraft, a Boeing 727, was still on runway 32. As visibility was good, the crew watched at a distance as the 727 powered up and departed. Once the runway was clear, Toronto Tower gave Flight 621 its landing clearance. With just 3 minutes and 10 seconds to disaster, the DC-8 passed over the airport perimeter and reached the threshold of runway 32, flying at an altitude of just 60 feet. At this moment, Captain Hamilton simply uttered, "Okay." First Officer Rowland reached for the spoiler lever, intending to move it into the armed position, as they had agreed. But in a moment of misjudgment, he mistakenly pulled the lever into the extend position instead. Instantly, all 10 spoilers on the wings deployed. The DC-8's lift was abruptly destroyed, causing an immediate and violent drop toward the ground. The aircraft suddenly sank, its rate of descent surging to a catastrophic 1,500 feet per minute. It took just 2 seconds for First Officer Rowland to realize his mistake. Sorry, Pete," he explained, fully aware of what had happened and immediately apologetic. A lot can be said about why this happened. One theory suggests that Rowland's muscle memory took over. He was used to manually fully deploying the spoilers on touchdown when flying with Captain Hamilton. In the intense moment of landing, he may have instinctively repeated the motion, unintentionally deploying them early in the flare instead of merely arming them. Another contributing factor was a design change in the DC-8. Earlier DC-8 models had a stiff, resistant spoiler lever, making accidental deployment less likely. However, Douglas had modified this in later models, including Flight 621's aircraft, to require less force to move the lever. Captain Hamilton immediately recognized the error. Reacting with incredible speed, he slammed all 4 throttles forward, commanding full power in an attempt to counteract the sudden sink rate. At the same time, he pulled back on the control yoke with all his strength, desperately trying to regain altitude. His efforts did help reduce the descent rate, but it was too late. At 8:06 and 36 seconds a.m., less than 3 minutes before disaster, Flight 621 slammed into the runway with an exceptionally hard landing, descending at nearly 1,000 feet per minute. What happened in this moment was complex, So let's break it down. The aircraft's main landing gear touched down first, but the impact was leaning to the right. Investigators later found that, despite the excessive vertical load forces far exceeding the DC-8's design limits, the landing gear itself remained mostly intact. However, the structural loads were transferred into the wings, causing severe damage. The right wing structure began to fail. The number 3 and number 4 engine pylons sustained massive stress, and engine number 4 physically tore away from the wing, taking part of the aircraft's lower wing plating with it. The impact punctured the number 4 alternate fuel tank, causing catastrophic fuel leakage. For half a second, Flight 621 scraped along the runway before Captain Hamilton managed to regain control and lift the aircraft back into the air, a touch-and-go landing that was never supposed to happen. However, the aircraft was now severely crippled. Engine number 4, its pylon structure, and parts of the right wing plating were left behind on the runway. The aircraft was now flying with only 3 of its 4 engines, and fuel was pouring from the ruptured wing tank. This was not supposed to be possible. The DC-8, like other modern aircraft, was designed with fail-safe engine pylon attachments. In an emergency, the engines were supposed to break away cleanly from the wings to prevent further structural damage. The system was meant to focus stress on designated attachment points, ensuring the engines detached without affecting the rest of the aircraft structure. But that didn't happen. Instead of the attachment bolts breaking cleanly, the stress transferred through the wing itself, causing devastating structural failure and rupturing the fuel tank. As the plane climbed, the spoilers slowly retracted, and the pilots began to assess the damage. Captain Hamilton attempted to stabilize the aircraft in a controlled climb, but something was wrong. The plane was pulling hard to the right. With engine number 4 missing, there was now less drag on the right wing, creating significant thrust asymmetry. This imbalance made the aircraft harder to control. Captain Hamilton commented, "We've lost our power." On the ground, Toronto Tower had already noticed something was wrong. Controllers saw Flight 621 bounce off the runway, climb, and struggle to maintain control. Eyewitnesses reported seeing flames trailing from the aircraft as it climbed away. Air Canada Flight 621 crashed into what was then farmland, near the town of Brampton, Ontario. The impact was catastrophic. The aircraft was completely obliterated, shattering into countless fragments. Residents from the surrounding area rushed to the scene, but there were no survivors. All 109 passengers and crew had perished instantly. The wreckage was so utterly destroyed that almost nothing recognizable as part of an airplane remained. One of the only identifiable objects found was a child's doll, later believed to have belonged to 8-year-old Wendy Weinberg. The disaster shocked Canada, ranking among the deadliest aviation accidents in the nation's history. Investigators were quickly dispatched to the crash site, but what they found was beyond devastation. Large portions of the aircraft had been buried deep into the earth by the force of the impact. It would take meticulous work to piece together what had happened. The site of the crash, however, would not remain farmland forever. The crash site today. In the decades that followed, massive urban expansion transformed the Toronto region. The once open farmland where Flight 621 fell was eventually redeveloped into suburban housing. Today, the crash site is marked by Purple Lilac Memorial Park, officially named in 2020, marking 50 years since the disaster. In 2013, a memorial was completed to ensure that the victims would never be forgotten. The park is small, but beautifully designed, featuring a clearing that leads into a wider field, an area where wreckage and even human remains were once found. Walking through the field today, plane parts are no longer visible. When the area was redeveloped, utility installations and housing foundations removed most of the remaining debris. At the entrance to the memorial garden, an information stand provides a brief history of the disaster, though some details are not entirely accurate. At the center of the garden, a plaque engraved with the names of all 109 victims is mounted on a large boulder, one of many sourced directly from the impact crater. The most striking feature of the memorial, however, is what lies on the ground. 109 pink-polished granite pyramids, each representing a victim of the disaster. These pyramids are not randomly placed. They are arranged in travel groups, symbolizing the families, friends, and solo travelers who perished together. A single, lighter-colored pyramid represents a solo traveler or crew member, perhaps Claude Holliday, traveling on business. A group of 3 may have been the Wong family. Twin sisters, like the Earl twins, are placed side by side. 2 groups of 5 represent 2 entire families lost in the crash. One particularly heartbreaking detail is the story of 11-year-old Susie Wong. She had only been brought along on the trip because her grandparents felt they would miss her too much. The memorial serves as a place of remembrance, but also as a public park, visited daily by locals walking their dogs, meeting friends, or simply enjoying the space. Despite the memorial's significance, Air Canada distanced itself from the tragedy for decades. Many relatives of the victims felt forgotten, criticizing the airline for its lack of engagement in preserving the memory of Flight 621. Standing at the site today, one is reminded of other places where tragedy and modern life intersect, like Miller Field on Staten Island, another crash site now surrounded by suburban sprawl. Yet, above Purple Lilac Memorial Park, jet engines can still be heard, as airplanes continue to pass over the very place where Flight 621 fell. The lack of awareness surrounding the DC-8 spoiler system became evident once again, just a few years later in 1973, when Loflier Flight 509, an Icelandic-operated DC-8, suffered significant damage after a hard landing at New York's Kennedy Airport. Although this incident was non-fatal, the parallels to Air Canada Flight 621 were striking. The Icelandic captain, Olaf Olsen, arguably the most Nordic name ever, had followed the same unofficial procedure of arming the ground spoilers on the flare. And, just like in the Air Canada disaster, the spoilers were accidentally deployed instead of armed. At just 40 feet above the runway, the aircraft sank abruptly, striking the ground tailfirst in a violent landing. When the NTSB investigated the accident, they made it clear that the DC-8's design lacked proper safeguards against this kind of human error. In their report, they specifically referenced Air Canada Flight 621, emphasizing that further corrective action was necessary. The fact that this had happened again was a serious concern, and if left unaddressed, it would continue to put lives at risk. As a result, a modification to the DC-8 was mandated to prevent in-flight spoiler deployment. Additionally, a caution plaque was installed in cockpits, warning pilots against deploying the ground spoilers in flight. Of course, none of this really matters today. The DC-8 is practically extinct in commercial aviation. Still, cases like these underscore the importance of pilots following procedures. Modern flight training places strict emphasis on adhering to checklists, and today, deviating from them would be unthinkable. Yet, it remains remarkably tragic how an issue that had been known for years before Flight 621 was never properly addressed. It stands as a haunting reminder that when risks are identified, action must be taken proactively, because failing to do so can cost lives. Throughout the making of this video, I kept thinking about First Officer Donald Rowland. During the crisis, it was clear that he blamed himself for everything that happened. But as we established at the very start of this episode, air disasters are never caused by just one thing. The official inquiry into Flight 621 sought to uncover the full story behind the accident. By now, we understand what happened and why DC-8 pilots disregarded the spoiler checklist. But one critical question remained. How were the spoilers even able to deploy in flight in the first place? What investigators would discover would expose serious flaws, not just in the aircraft's design, but in the very system that certified it as safe to fly. Hey everyone! Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. A huge thank you to my friend Rosalind, who supplied some of the background music for this episode. I'll drop a link to her channels in the description. Also, a big thanks to Kyra, aka Admiral Cloudberg, an absolute legend in air accident analysis, who was kind enough to lend her voice for a few lines in this episode. You'll find her links, including one to her podcast, in the description as well. This was a case I've been meaning to cover for a long time. And, since I've already traveled to New York and Malaga for past videos, I figured, why not make the trip to Canada as well? I believe I covered everything I wanted to in this episode. But here's something interesting. Remember when I mentioned that only one known photograph of the aircraft exists? Well, as it stands right now, that's still true. However, I did say that other photos once existed, photos that have since become lost media. These weren't just any photos, they were taken during the final moments of the crash sequence, just seconds before impact. We know they existed because the film was handed over to investigators. If these images ever resurface, they could be among the most stunning aviation photographs ever captured, on the level of the famous American 191 crash photo or the Ethiopian 961 video. So, if you're into lost media, like I am, and you'd love to try tracking these images down, I'll leave a link with more details in the description and pinned comment. And with that, we've reached the end of the video. I need to take a moment to thank my incredible patrons over on Patreon for their amazing support. Their names are scrolling on the screen right now, so if you see your name, huge thanks to you. I've got a few more shoutouts today. In business class, in order of when they joined. Indira Sanchez, John LaValle, and Emily Casey, thank you all so much. And in first class, a massive thanks to Doug Bramley and Synamic, absolute legends. If you'd like to support the channel and have your name featured in the next video, you can join the Disaster Breakdown Patreon for as little as £1 per month. The link will be in the pinned comment below. All patrons get early access to new videos at least 2 days before they go public on YouTube. If you want to stay connected, I post mainly on Twitter, and you'll find my link in the pinned comment as well. That's all from me today. Thank you so much for watching, have a great day, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.